Hello, everyone. It's 1 o'clock on the East Coast, 1 o'clock Eastern Daylight Savings Time. I'm Paul Merrill. I'm from Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services, and we help companies with automated testing. We eat, sleep, live, and breathe test automation and automated testing. We help companies progress within test automation by training, consulting, and by having our experts come on board and help their teams. As a part of all this, as a part of this business, we do these webinars and we love to get you all involved. We love to be able to share what we've learned and share what other folks in the industry have learned. So today I'm very excited to have Melissa Tondi join us. She's going to be on in just a minute here. And she'll be talking about the 5 do nots of testing. So before we get started with that, I have a couple messages, a couple things that I like to do. Also make note of Melissa's Twitter handle there. So Melissa Tondi, just at Melissa Tondi. That's a nice one when you can get your name on your handle, your full name. That's pretty cool. So we'll have Melissa with us in just a minute. It looks like a bunch of you folks are already on board here. We'll also give people a few minutes to join us as they're still kind of filing in. So if you've joined us before, and it looks like I'm not sharing, let me know if I'm having trouble sharing here. There we go. And I'm going to go back just in case that didn't share with you. There is Melissa's Twitter handle, Melissa Tondi, at Melissa Tondi. And let's see, so if you've joined us before, you know about the B list, the Beaufort Fairmont thank you list. And each month I like to sit down and take a few moments to think about the people who have helped our company, people who have helped me personally or my family or things like that in the last little period of time. It's an exercise that I feel like it's important to do because it is a lot of us working together for things here, and Beaufort Fairmont would not be as successful without the people who surround us and who help us out and support us. So if you see a name up there that looks like yours, but you're not quite sure, and we've talked recently or had an exchange recently, it's probably you, okay? That's probably you. So thank you very much for whatever you did. Sometimes those are just small things. Sometimes it's just a nice thing that you said or retweeted something or been my facilitator down at CAST or something like that. So thank you very much for all you've done, each one of you. And talking about CAST, we have some things upcoming. I was down at the conference for the Association of Software Testing in Cocoa Beach last week. We had a wonderful time. It's a smaller conference, about 100 and some odd people, but it was a very tight conference. Everybody learned to know, got to know each other, lots of interaction, lots of good conversation, lots of really strong influencers in the test world. And we had a great time. The talks all went well. I got to see a new friend, Jess, play her violin live on stage, learning a new piece of music. And when she did this, she was teaching us how she learns new thing and how that relates to her testing. And I thought it was just really, really cool. So don't miss CAST next year. I don't know where it'll be held, but they've been in Cocoa Beach the last couple of years. Upcoming, the next webinar will be in September. We're working on a date for that, and I will get information to you as soon as possible. If you haven't signed up yet, you can go on our website, beaufortfairmont.com, go to the webinars section, and inside the webinars at the very bottom, you can click to make sure that you get email updates about our webinars. So make sure to do that. The 23rd through the 26th of September, I'll be down at STPCon with a couple of our folks on our team here. We're sponsoring STPCon just like we sponsored CAST. And it's something that we really appreciate the opportunity to do. So anytime we can sponsor these events and help the testing community move forward, help support the conversations that are going on in the testing community, and to help people increase their skills and get better within testing and test automation, we want to do that if we can. So we've had the opportunity to do that with CAST this year. We did it with Automation Guild. We've done it with a number of other conferences as well. QA or the Highway up in Ohio, which was an awesome event. And STPCon is another one that we're excited about. So STPCon is a great conference. If you haven't been to one, it's a fun conference, lots of wonderful people there, wonderful speakers, world-renowned testing speakers. It's in Boston, Massachusetts this year. I'll be speaking about refactoring. We'll also have a booth there, so make sure to stop by. If you want to save 10%, use this code, BEAUFAIR, BOFAIR. So make sure to use that code and get 10% off for STPCon. You know we do a $50 Amazon card giveaway each time we do this. Make sure to stick around until the end of the webinar for a chance to win. And now it's time for the content. Thank you all so much again for being here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Melissa here. I'm excited to have her on. Melissa and I have known each other for quite a while. Melissa has spent most of her career working within software testing teams. She is the founder of Denver Mobile and Quality, DMAQ, past president and board member of Software Quality Association of Denver, otherwise known as SQUAD, and quality engineer at E-Trade, where she assists teams to continuously improve the pursuit of quality software from design to delivery and everything in between. Follow Melissa on Twitter at Melissa Tondi and keep up with her latest on her LinkedIn page. Melissa, welcome. It's good to have you.
I am very happy to be here. Thank you so much for these webinars. These have been great. I've listened to several of them in the past, and I just hope to be able to live up to the ones that I've heard that have been awesome. So thank you for having me.
You will. You will. I'm handing over the ball now to make you the presenter. So, and I'll tell you when I can see this, or I'm trying to. Technical glitches. Here we go. See if that works.
All right.
Here we go. It looks like it's starting to work.
Excellent.
Don't see your screen yet.
Don't see it? Okay. Let's.
And while Melissa is talking and while she's getting this set up, make sure when you have questions as we go along, either type them into the questions section here or share them with me, share them with us. You can raise your hand. There's a little button to raise your hand there in the console somewhere. It shows that you're sharing your screen. I just am not, you know what, I know what it is. It probably is showing. It is showing. All right, Melissa, you're good to go. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. And still everything look good on your end, Paul?
It looks great. Yep.
Great. Okay. All right. Again, thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this webinar. It's the first time I've participated in a Beaufort Fairmont webinar, and I'm very excited. So this talk has really kind of stemmed from my many years, and I'm not going to tell you how exactly many years it's been in the industry, but it's really I've been kind of forming some talks over the last couple of years on things that we've done within the QA software quality or testing industry, and things that we should always be looking at readdressing. So these 5 do nots kind of serve as a reminder that innovation should always be at the forefront of our industry. At the very end of the day, we are technologists, and without having innovation as something that is our North Star in a lot of ways, we tend to become stale, or we tend to become a little bit more mired in things that may have worked well or when they were introduced 5, 10, 15, sometimes longer ago. But just the fact that we should be looking at things that we've put in place to make sure that they're still relevant. Because even best laid plans and ideas that make it into our original QA playbook should be revisited from time and time again to ensure they're still applicable today, making sure that we're tapping into the latest and greatest where applicable within our team and organization. That importantly, they align with our industry. A lot of times what winds up happening, especially if you're in a company or a team that has, say, homegrown tools where tools were created that serve a very specific use case or specific goal for your team, but may not be really transferable outside of your team or organization, we want to make sure that we're always aligning with the industry so that we keep those standards and consistent guidelines so that we can both contribute to the community as well as consume from the community, and that they're collaboratively agreed to. So we've seen a lot of sometimes, especially in enterprise-wide test automation strategies, for example, where the QA or QE team has agreed to a tool or a framework or several tools or several frameworks where the purpose is that not just the QA team would be using them, but because we've made those decisions in maybe a silo and didn't actually seek the feedback or review or guidance from our dev, product, and other counterparts, we tend to start using those tools and framework within a very specific silo, and we don't really tap into the value of that collaborative conversation so that other teams outside of QA may be able to start using the solutions we're putting into. So when we start talking about building playbooks, best laid plans, we want to make sure that these three are always at the forefront of what we're doing. So we're going to start into our very first do not. So do not be the enabler. What do I mean by the enabler? And so if you're familiar with some of the 12-step programs, there is a certain term called the enabler. And generally speaking, when we become the enabler, it's certainly not out of being malicious. It's certainly not out of something with a negative connotation. It's generally because we're trying to be the team player. We're trying to save the sprint. We're trying to save this release. We're winding up because of things that may have become derailed during either sprints or day-to-day injection work, or just natural things that happen during software development. We generally find ourselves making up that work at the end. And this probably resonates with a lot of you, especially if you're aligning with a 2 or 3 week sprint cycle, if you're practicing agile practices. But even if you're not practicing a scrum or sprint style of an agile method, we generally wait for a lot of things until the very end, which means that the tester or the QA team generally winds up spending a lot of their time towards the end making up for things that should have been delivered to us throughout the sprint or throughout the day. So we wind up becoming the enabler because we don't generally try and fix it, because we're also concentrated on saving the sprint and making up that time at the end. We save the team schedules, for example, right? A lot of times when we make up work at the end, we may not have been able to finish everything completely. So we have a lot of rollover work, right? And then what winds up happening is when we have a lot of rollover work happening from sprint to sprint, is that we have these big, long, arduous regression test times where dev may be working on something on their own, and we're kind of finishing and preparing for the release. So we wind up saving the team's schedules, but a lot of times what happens during that is that we wind up not fixing the source of some of those issues. We wind up not maybe tapping into some of the agile ceremonies like a retro or something similar, where we talk about the things that may have happened to where we're always the ones that seem to be working towards the end and kind of adding those extra hours, sometimes in the evening, sometimes in the weekend, to save those schedulers. It's definitely a perceived value to the team. Right? Because of course, when we can save a sprint and we can complete everything before that next sprint planning or before the next piece of work starts, we've kind of come in and saved the day. However, sometimes what happens is that we become, instead of the QA team, we become the why didn't you catch that team, right? So a lot of times when we're cramming in a lot of work at the end of those sprints, we're working extra hours, long days, our own quality sometimes takes a hit. And not that necessarily QA are the ones that let bugs into production, but we tend to be the team that always gets the finger pointed at us if and when something of a high severity or a high priority winds up escaping into production, or is reported by one of our users or by somebody who's actively looking in production. So we want to try and give that up. When we think about the enabler, all happening with good intentions, but without actually addressing the behaviors that have caused us to be the enabler, we're not actually tapping into one of the main components of our agile approach, which is collaborative conversations and relationship building within the team. So the next do not is do not automate everything. And hopefully this is still kind of, I still think that this is pretty pervasive in our world, but I many times ask the questions, are you being held to a certain metric of a certain percentage of test cases that exist in more of a traditional test management tool? Are you being held to a certain number or a certain percentage of automating those test cases? And a lot of times the answer is yes. And that percentage or number can vary from company to company, but I certainly hear things of 100% is our goal. but we're trying to focus at 70% or 75%, right? What we all know as professionals, and especially for those of you who have deep expertise in test automation, and I'm assuming most of you do since you're attending a Beaufort Fairmont webinar, but that not all tests should or can be automated, right? No, really, right? So we want to make sure that whenever we have that metric or that kind of guidance or mandate that we need to automate as much as possible or automate everything with the goal of being 100%, we know that that can be a failure in our overall enterprise-wide automation strategy. Because when you're generally held to a meaningless outcome like everything, your creative license can essentially be removed, which means that the people who are tasked with automating tests generally tend to be siloed. It may be perhaps in a different team where they're working off of a backlog that may have been prioritized by somebody that they're not working with on a day-to-day basis. For example, we have, you may be working in where a manual tester is working collaboratively within an agile delivery team or an agile project team, and they may be the ones that are checking a test case to say, oh, this is a good candidate for automation. And then maybe a day or two or a sprint or two or a week or two, something down the line, that story winds up making it into the test automator's backlog. And then the next thing they know is they're tasked with automating that. So when we start thinking about these automate everything types of mandates, we really want to make sure that we're addressing really the value, and that not only the value to the QA team, but start thinking about the value of how automated tests can provide expertise and recommendations across the delivery and project teams. So the next do not have QA only sprints or cycles. And we kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier when we see one of the symptoms of a lot of rollover, or when the teams aren't quite able to finish everything to include testing within a sprint, we tend to see those rollovers. And so if your delivery cycle or production releases follow pretty typical sprints and cycles of mainstream companies, you may have several sprints that make up work for a particular production release. So we'll just call it maybe 6 sprints, so 8 weeks or so, or 12 weeks or so of development work, and then we're preparing for a big production release, especially for those of you who are not quite practicing a continuous delivery model, or you are kind of beholden to users. You may need a downtime or something to take down the system, which generally means that we're kind of creating less frequent releases into production, but larger releases into production. And what winds up happening is that we have these QA only sprints or cycles, work that is only designated for QA. Again, kind of using that example from earlier, we may have a lot of regression testing that has built up, or a lot of rollover work from sprint to sprint. And next thing you know, with that last sprint, when that last story from development is complete, we take another estimate of how long we need, and sometimes we may need 2, 3, 4 weeks of regression time that becomes a QA only cycle in there, or we sometimes call it a QA hardening type of time. But basically what we mean is 1 or more sprints before the release that's dedicated to testing by QA only. And I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing by QA only. A lot of times we see in most teams, I know, we generally are guided by the whole team's success. So I know many developers, many product owners, even Scrum Masters or others on the team that have jumped in to execute tests, because we tend to find ourselves in this situation more often than not. But basically, anything that's dedicated to simply testing and only by the QA team. Generally, what winds up happening is that dev has started on work that perhaps is represented in another release or the next sprint or something, but anything that causes QA to have their own sprint or hardening cycle, we want to make sure that we avoid that. So the next do not is do not own all testing. And this one might sound counterintuitive, right? We all know kind of the standard testing that dev does. They do their unit tests, they do, hopefully anyway, they're doing integration testing. But a lot of times, and especially if you've worked with very mature and collaborative developers, they actually do their own types of individual quality checks as part of their own individual metrics of quality, right? So things that are never really captured in documentation, but they're actually doing some of their own testing. But generally speaking, when we say that we are going to own all of the testing, we tend to then kind of use some of that enablement behavior to then make the assumption that we own all of the testing, which means that in some cases, developers may rightfully or wrongfully take advantage of us owning all testing and let us do that. So we'll talk a little bit about when we start addressing these do nots. We'll start talking about some of the ways that we can really work together with developers and others on our team so that the precedent is not set that QA owns all of the testing. Of course, we own a lot of the testing because at the end of the day, we are testers, we're test professionals, and we are actively or should be actively interacting with the software and providing real-time information back to our team. But the assumption that we own all testing and that others do not need to test their own work is simply a fallacy, and quite frankly, something that has really kind of become one of the thorns in the side of the dev and QA relationship, especially if you struggle within your organization with kind of an us versus them mentality, which hopefully we don't have that. But for those of you who may be experiencing that, we want to make sure that we're setting the precedent that QA does not own all the testing. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, again, as we address these 5 do nots. So do not hide information. And I know that when I'm looking at this, it seems pretty negative, right? Well, of course, I'm not going to hide information. That would be me not being a team player. And I don't mean, again, kind of explicitly hiding information, although sometimes we do see those in some, members of our team where we have a single point of contact that we generally hear the term, well, all that information is in his or her head, right? And sometimes when we don't make the effort to kind of centralize one person's information, that person becomes a single point of contact. But more importantly, when too much information is held in that person's head, that person also becomes the single point of failure. So when you become that single point of contact, taking vacation time or taking a sick day here and there, or just taking some mental health days really tend to rock the other teams, the rest of the team's world, because all of that information is within that person's head. So let's talk a little bit about kind of do not hiding that information and exactly what I mean by that. So there's a concept of explicit versus implicit information. So explicit information is information that's readily available. Explicit information tends to look like user stories with acceptance criteria, requirements, business specs, something, even specific information that is shared within stand-ups, things that are known by more than 2 people or certainly across the team. It's information that's readily available, it's centralized and available to everyone that is working within a delivery or agile team. Stories, again, kind of acceptance criteria, requirements. Those are generally speaking information that we consider explicit information. When we talk about implicit information, it's information that's generally not centralized or shared with the team. So that tends to be, going back to the example of that person or people who have all of the information in their head, that's implicit information. It may be explicit to that person where that information in their brain resides, but it's not explicit to the rest of the team, or it's not shared with the team. It also looks like one-on-one conversations. You may have a developer or a product owner sitting at a laptop sharing information, and they're kind of doing a further refinement of acceptance criteria, and they're having conversations that result in a change in behavior to the story or the feature that they're working on that has come out of those one-on-one conversations. Subjective look and feel experiences. So as I'm testing something and I'm interacting with that product or that software, whether I'm on production or on a lower environment, I'm gathering that information and I am developing a feeling of how that software, how I'm experiencing that software, but I may not be sharing that. It's something that's kind of more intrinsic and personal to me. User information, customer service or client service managers, support teams or help desk or tech support, or actual users. So information that these teams may have, and it may be centralized and explicit within their teams, but because they're not traditionally part of an Agile team, it may not be explicit to developers or testers or product who could use that information to further refine and make those stories a lot more testable and demoable. So when we start thinking about hiding information, we want to make sure that we're always looking at implicit information and explicit information. And again, as we move over into how do we address these do nots, we'll talk about ways that we can make sure that we're looking at both implicit and explicit information. And more importantly, what do we do with implicit information, and how do we address explicit information and use it to the best of our advantage? So when we talk about being the enabler, instead of being the enabler, let's be a musketeer. And I know that sounds a little kitschy, but the phrase all for one and one for all really is one of the main keystones of Agile. And again, you may not be practicing within an Agile organization, or you may just be starting your journey into Agile transformation. But, and I certainly tend to, reference more from an Agile standpoint, simply because that's my experience. But all of these do nots should be applicable anyway, and certainly relevant whether you are whether you are on an Agile team or not. But we want to make sure that we're tapping into that collaborative team success. If one part of the team fails, the team fails. Also, same with success. If one of the team members or parts of the team, the Agile delivery team, has success, then that should be shared amongst everybody within the team. But we tend to point fingers when one part of the team or an individual fails versus having that same type of, versus sharing that failure and figuring out how could the team have either prevented this failure, or how could the team address that so that that failure doesn't happen again. We address that by using risk-based and context-driven approaches. These are two certainly not approaches that these have been around for a while. There are many thought leaders, much more experienced than myself, that have written literally the book on risk-based and context-driven approaches. The idea is that when we are part of the team and when we start allowing things to fail so that we can fix the problem, those failures tend to bubble up so that it naturally becomes the responsibility of the team to address it and ideally fix it later. If we are always the one that is saving the sprint or working those extra days or extra hours or weekends because all of our work has come to us the last couple of days of a sprint, we will never actually allow for the process of Agile and the method of Agile to really be used to not only celebrate the team successes, but also to address the team failures in there. When we use risk-based and context-driven approaches, we should be able to know what gives when the schedule won't. So sometimes what it looks like is, instead of us working more hours or even beyond, well, we'll just swarm all of the testing towards the end and have dev and PO and the Scrum Master or others jump in to do the testing at the end. So we may have only had a day or two left within the sprint, but if we throw 15 bodies at it, we can shrink that down and get it all done, right? And that's a very, very typical kind of an acute solution for what winds up being a more of a pervasive symptom. But when we can do that, so we can always come back to the team and say, hey, I don't have enough time now to test thoroughly these last few stories that have come my way in the last of the sprint. Here are a couple of options. We can swarm it and I will gladly be able to give tests out, and with the expectation that everyone that is testing both does scripted and unscripted testing, scripted being traditional automated test scripts or test cases, unscripted being more exploratory or ad hoc testing, always kind of having that at the forefront of how we approach testing. But most importantly, we should be able to prioritize our tests to know, hey, if our schedule has decreased and we don't necessarily want to decrease our own quality by adding more hours to our day or our week, we can have that compromise of, well, here's what we can test given the natural timeline of what's left in our sprint, and allow the team to assess that risk along with you. But if we don't have our tests prioritized, I like to tend to have a prioritization of a 1, 2, 3. Priorities 1. Tests are generally those that they should all be in some sort of a passing state before we release, and we kind of further down the line. But we could quickly pull out those higher priority tests and then determine how long it might take to execute those, plus add in that unscripted testing time. But if we are not using risk-based and context-driven approaches, we will always come back and say, well, it's going to take us X number of hours to complete all of the tests that we have already planned to do, and now we need to add extra hours to our sprint. So the idea is to allow the team to understand the risk. We, as the subject matter expert within our field of testing, should be able to provide recommendations based off of our based off of our own context-driven approaches, by layering risk-based testing approaches as well, so that we can provide our expert recommendation on how we should move forward, but always allowing the team to ultimately self-manage and make that decision on behalf of the team. And just as a reminder, as I kind of go through some of these, there is a section within the webinar for you to pull up questions. So if there's anything here, we'll certainly add time. We'll certainly have time at the end to address questions, but start queuing up those questions if anything that I say piques your interest or you want to learn more about that. And then we'll move into the questions at the end of this, but just as a reminder to add those questions in there. So how do we address the do not automate everything, do not? I love this quote. We came up with this quote several years ago, and I think this still holds true today. Test automation makes humans more efficient, not less essential. And I'm hoping at some point I can just remove this quote from my content. There are still certainly people that have a misconception of what test automation is and what its ultimate outcome and goal is. And for those of us who have seen successful test automation strategies in place, it really is one more tool in our toolbox so that the human testers, also known as manual testers, so to speak, but the humans that are interacting with the software and that can provide that information that test automation or other types of testing activities simply can't provide. We want to make sure that we are always using that to what its real intent is, which is to make that testing, the interaction of the software when we're interacting with it as our users do or on behalf of our users, it makes us much more efficient versus less essential. So we want to make sure that that's kind of our, again, North Star of when we start thinking about building automation, test automation strategies in there, that should be one of the guiding principles of what test automation means and looks like within QA teams and organizations. So how do we do that? Well, one of the metrics that we've come up with is the A of A, and that simply means automated of automatable. So when we look at a percentage of test cases, and that generally means, somebody with, many layers above the individual contributor says, I would like to see X number of percentage of our test cases automated, which then it kind of introduces that middleman strategy of somebody before the test automators that are selecting the things that should be automated based off of a certain number. And we're going off of test cases versus having the creative and intelligence of that test automator actually be able to influence what we should be automating at the start of the work versus kind of having that flow down from one or more people that winds up checking a box to say automate this. So the idea is that this selection process, once you have a good priority of tests that you want to focus on to automate, because they not only provide value to the QA team, but ideally that same value is also seen across the delivery teams. The more that your delivery teams can see the value in what is coming out of the test automators, or for any tester that's interacting with the software, the more support you'll have if and when something needs to be addressed. If you've got a ton of failing tests that may not necessarily be associated with, say, a software bug, but they may need to be refactored or something. The idea is that this selection process, the automatable or A of A, it succinctly shows you the percentage of automated valuable tests given the criteria that you define. And we certainly have a lot of, probably every company has a slightly different criteria of what they use to determine what should be automated. But generally, we want to make sure that they're adhering to coding standards and guidelines. Optimization, one of the biggest things is no hard-coded values is one thing that generally makes it into almost every automation criteria. But the idea is that the people who are automating should own what that criteria is. And once we get to the point where that's defined and understood by everybody, then we can see a much better and higher percentage of automatable versus simply tying that to the number of test cases that exist in a traditional test management tool. So how does it work in real life? So we refine. And that means that the person automating or who has responsibility in automating is part of those refinement talks. They are defining whether or not it's an intake test, a smoke test, a user advocacy test, in that order. And this, I'm saying this, this may not match the priority order that you choose to use, but this is something that for many companies that I've either worked with or consulted for, this tends to make a lot of sense within those organizations. But more importantly than using this as your guide, you should be very confident in making and defining those priority orders of what and when what gets automated and when. And then we automate, right? And then we tie it to shippable. So what do I mean by shippable? So shippable really is what we consider the red bow or the cherry on top. So when we're looking at sprints at the end, we tend to be siloed with, especially if you're using a tool like Jira or Rally or something similar where there's columns, whether you're using more of a Scrum method or a Kanban method or something in between, we tend to consider our work done when it has moved out of our column and to the column to the right. So if I'm a developer and I've coded everything, I've merged, I've checked in, it's gone through code review, I move it into that next column. Sometimes that column is ready for test or dev complete or something, but I tend to say, okay, well, I'm done with that. I'm going to move on to my next thing. I'm going to move on to my next story or the next piece of work that has been prioritized for me. And then it gets into the QA column, and the QA does all their scripted and unscripted testing, and everything is passing in an ideal world, of course. And then we move that out and we move it into the next column, and it goes into this very ambiguous column called ready for release or done or something like that. When we start talking about shippable and the components, that means that there are still things after all of our traditional pillars within our Agile team. There are still things that we need to be considering. What do we need to do in order to actually ship this? And so by actually using shippable as one of the success criteria that we use to determine how complete we are within a sprint, it really starts guiding the conversations and the outcome of the work within the sprint or within the Agile teams, so that they're thinking about not just am I dev complete, am I test complete, but what else do I need to do in order for this piece of work to actually be delivered and be consumed by our users. So it really kind of guides a lot of those conversations, so that not only are we complete with the sprint because dev and QA are complete, but we're also shippable. And that then kind of spurs some conversation on, just because we are shippable may not mean that we wind up shipping, but at least we're putting in all of those small kind of, again, cherry on top, or the bow on the end of the gift, on there, that we're actually considering what else do we need to do in order to actually deliver this and have it consumed by our users. So that leads into the do not of only having QA only sprints or cycles. So if we use shippable as one of our guiding principles, we can follow the ABC rule. And what do I mean by that? Always be coupled with dev. And I don't necessarily mean that. I don't necessarily mean that, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, we are going to be, attached at the hip with our developer. But the idea is that we're coupled with them, knowing that if there's ever more than 2 days from when a developer is starting their work and when we can actually start testing that work, that should be considered a kind of a flag in the back of our mind, and something that we discuss in stand-up, because we know that more than 2 days time, especially when we start finding bugs within that work, it's a lot of context switching with dev to be able to troubleshoot any issues that we may find during our testing, right? So anytime that we are more than 2 days away from when dev has started, that may be considered something for the team to address as part of a stand-up, and ultimately will lend itself into a sprint's health. We try an 8-10 sprint. And what I mean by an 8-10 sprint, sorry about that, is that we maybe lower the expectations of work, and instead of considering 10 full working days of development, full front working development that's happening for all 10 days within a sprint, perhaps we reduce that velocity by 2 days, and we set the expectations that by the end of a sprint day 8, dev will be focusing on those last 2 days of a 10-day sprint, actually hardening their code and getting it ready for shippable, so that, again, even if we decide not to ship at the end of the sprint, at least it's ready to ship if and when we decide to. And that lays the tracks for moving into a continuous delivery cycle, which I'm assuming that if your organization isn't already practicing some sort of a continuous delivery cycle, it's probably in somebody's mind that we need to be doing that. I can guarantee you that we're probably not going to see less frequent or less, a decreased number of releases per year. We're likely going to see a much more increased number of releases in a year, which means that continuous delivery is something that likely most engineering leaders are thinking about introducing or are already practicing within their organization. So, do not own all testing. Know your devs and the rest of your team. As I mentioned earlier, I've worked with some fabulous developers who have really gone above and beyond and have tested their own work. The sad part about that is that that's generally something that we tend to not know about. When we think about testing, usually the question I ask the QA team members, or really anyone on the team, is what types of unit testing or intake testing, a combination of unit and integration tests, what kind of standards are being followed within the development group? Is there a standard? Is there some sort of expectation that there is intake, either unit or integration testing or both, that's happening within the development team? Do you have access to that? Are they gated in some way where those unit tests need to be running green before that code moves on to the next environment or something like that? Most of the time, when I ask that question of what our unit testing standards are within the dev team, the answer I usually get is either I don't know, or there is no standard. In that situation, then what winds up happening is, because QA or the testers don't have access or don't have visibility into the testing that's already happening, we take it upon ourselves to then own all of the testing, because we make the assumption that no other testing has been done. Therefore, we do need to own all the testing. The idea is to understand who else, or who should be, is testing within our cycle. I also have worked with fabulous product owners or product managers or business analysts that are testing right alongside of QA, but because that's not necessarily part of their job description, they tend to not really bring that up. The idea is to find out what they're doing and encourage consistency. So if you find a developer who does a fabulous job of testing her own work and their code reviews come out as stellar, have them share that and see if that's something of that what that individual is doing for their own quality checks, if that's something that can be encouraged and actually disseminated across the rest of the team, so that every developer is also practicing the same type of quality checks. And once we know all of the testing that's happening, we can really target our own strategy of focusing first on the areas that have previously not been tested before by any part of our team to the left of us. And we're going to focus our efforts there first, because we know that that's the highest risk. And again, using risk-based testing approaches, we identify the risk and we swarm there first and prioritize appropriately. We use the DoD, or the definition of done, to our advantage, and we swarm. And I say the definition of done, specifically, it's not just for product anymore, that we tend to use that term and it belongs to product, right? And so, well, this is what definition of done means for us to complete or be successful with this sprint. There's a lot of value in having each team represented within the delivery team to have their own definition of done. So to say, when I'm in this column on our board and I'm doing all of my testing things, here are all the things that I am going to be doing in order for me to make it out of this column, and I move it to the next column, indicating that my testing work is complete. By having that centralized and then ideally referenced back to everyone within their column to define the things that go on within that column, so that we don't have to ask continuously whether it's been done. We assume that it's being done because that's the working agreements that we have with our team. But we start using the concept of definition of done and applying it to the teams that are part of the delivery team. So I go again and kind of go into a little bit of detail of what this looks like, but the important things are that the definition of done is central. It removes the misperception that QA owns all the testing and quality, because each person or each team has indicated what they're going to be doing, and it becomes consistent from sprint to sprint or from delivery to delivery, and then it just becomes part of each team's own working playbook. So do not hide information. So once we've uncovered implicit information, it's kind of our responsibility to make it explicit. So what do I mean by that? Again, if we're part of those heads down one-on-one conversation, and that conversation winds up changing an acceptance criteria or a requirement or the behavior of the story after it's already been refined with dev, QA, and product, or whoever else has responsibility on that story, it's kind of our responsibility to make sure that once implicit information becomes explicit. That may mean that we're updating the story with that information that we've just discovered as part of that heads down one-on-one conversation. We may bring it up also in a stand-up, or we may choose to bring in that third party to say, hey, we're having a really interesting conversation on this user story. Why don't you come over and listen, because this will likely change the behavior of the story. So we're making what once was implicit information explicit, and we're therefore not hiding information, we're uncovering it. So things that we can do as a stretch goal for making implicit information explicit. If it's written, it's explicit. And so what I mean by that is, the usual suspects are requirements, user stories, acceptance criteria, maybe system requirements, documentation that's somehow attached to a story or something. That's all pretty explicit information. Other information that's explicit are written test cases or written test scripts or charters from an exploratory standpoint. If it's written, it should be considered explicit, which means that if it's also written, it's been refined. A story should be refined not only with product and, say, a developer, but anyone that has responsibility for completing that story. And if it's explicit, it's also understood, which means that it's our responsibility to make sure that we are tapping into all of that explicit information that is ideally centralized and available to us. And that if there's a situation where we might not understand it, it's our responsibility to make sure that we do understand that. So when we think about if it's a test, it should pass. So if we use the explicit and implicit model on the day-to-day, we should be providing tests to our developers so that they can use those tests to write their code with the outcome of those tests passing. And that may sound very familiar to some of you who are either practicing or have some knowledge on a TDD or test-driven development approach. And I'm not necessarily advocating that we should all move to a TDD approach. Some organizations just can't, or it's not going to be successful, but at least the main components of a TDD approach are there. We should be actively, when we're refining those stories from a testing standpoint, we should at least be talking about how we would start testing it to plant that seed in the developer's head, so that before they start writing that first piece of code to satisfy that story, they've already heard, or best case scenario, they have seen the tests that we will be running, whether they're running the scripted tests, whether they're running in our automated framework, or we're executing them via a test management tool, but they've heard, and they can also reference and see the tests in order for them to write their code for those tests to pass. Again, I call this a stretch goal because a lot of times we tend to not share those tests, or some cases we may not have written those tests by the time development has started. So consider that a stretch goal and something that we can certainly go through. So refinement, this is one of the most important meetings, I think, that Agile has introduced. A present state, right? We have misunderstood ambiguous acceptance criteria. We have one-sided refinements where QA may not be invited. We have anchored sizing, which, because we don't know enough at the time when we're asked to size a story, we tend to look at the person who has that most information. And, whenever we count backwards to size something, whether it's a t-shirt size or a Fibonacci series sizing, we tend to kind of look at that person who has the most information. If that developer or somebody else says, oh, that's a 5, we tend to agree with him or her because we don't have enough information in there. And so we want to kind of avoid these present state refinements that tend to be happening. The new state of refinements is that we meet, and not necessarily formally, but that we meet with everyone that has responsibility for the story. Part of our state of what was our responsibility when we go into refine work is that devs should be giving an overview of their plan and talking about regression needs and impact analysis. They should be able to provide that information as part of that refinement. The PO or the PDM should be able to answer questions, refine the AC, perhaps as those conversations are happening, and QA or QE should be able to give an overview of what they will test. And the outcome of this kind of new state of refinement is that everyone has what they need to start work, and a story is not considered refined or groomed until everyone gets there, which means that if you are practicing, say, a Scrum type of method, that means that if a story doesn't actually have these as an outcomes, that story should not actually be planned or committed to for the next sprint. So all of this kind of combines into how I define a quality engineer. So by removing these do nots, you can shift to become a more modern team member, which we, again, consider the quality engineer. And the quality engineer is best defined by have the ability to influence the building of the software before the software is built. So in summary, the enabler. It's okay to be an enabler because of most of the times it's not malicious, but be a musketeer. It's okay to let things fail sometimes. To address the automate everything. Use the A of A and define the criteria first. Have your test automators define that and stick to the guidelines and criteria. To avoid the QA only sprints and cycles, focus on shippable, and perhaps introduce the 8-10 sprint, and I'm happy to answer other questions on that. Do not own all the testing. Find out who else is testing and make it consistent, and use the definition of done or DOD to your advantage. Don't hide information. refine and refine again, and maybe even again, and maybe even again. But the idea is to make implicit information more explicit, and it's our responsibility to bring that back into the fold. So with that said, we've got a few minutes for other questions. I'll let Paul field those if we do have any questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to follow up LinkedIn, Twitter, email, and I'd love to hear any questions if there are any.
Hey, Melissa, thanks. That was great.
Great.
So we do have a few questions. We're running out of time pretty quickly here, though, so we might only get one or two in. So I'm going to give you this one. I thought this was interesting. It was one that I had as well. Tessa asks, will you give an example of an intake test versus user advocacy?
Sure. So intake tests so I align definitions terminology that I use with our ISTQB glossary. If you do not use that as a glossary, what I found the biggest value of using that glossary is that it really does contain almost all of the testing terms that we use on the day-to-day, and some terms that we may not have ever used in the past, and that we're currently not using. But the idea, so how the ISTQB defines an intake test is the combination of an integration and a unit test. So those typically and traditionally tend to be written by the development team. And again, by asking what the standards are for intake tests or integration or unit tests siloed in that manner, you'll kind of understand, what that guide is and what the guidelines are, whether they're being adhered to, but more importantly, then make the distinction between a user advocacy test. I consider user advocacy tests the tests that typically mimic how a user is interacting with the software on production, and we want to make sure that that is as much data driven as possible. So being able to have access to event tracking software such as Google Analytics and others allows for us to actually use data on how our users are interacting with the software and prioritize those appropriately so that they become user advocacy tests. So that's how I define the difference between them. Again, ISTQB does a great job of defining intake tests. User advocacy tests is a little bit more ambiguous, but that's how I define the difference.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your help and everything. One of the questions we had is, do I have a new profile picture? And I guess it's because my hair is up today. So just as a matter of course, I don't change my profile picture every time I put my hair up, but I know it is strange for people to see, and my glasses are on and all. So I get that. But appreciate it so much today, Melissa. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over here, and we're going to do this giveaway, which I'm always so thrilled to be able to do.
Awesome.
There's nothing like having, well, there are a few things like it, but it is nice to have an extra $50 in your Amazon account.
Absolutely.
And you go in there and you're like, I need a new book. And then you're like, oh yeah, I won $50 from Beaufort Fairmont. Let me use that. And I'm trying to figure out how to make myself the presenter again. It's different today for some reason. There we go, make presenter. And I'm going to share main screen. Let's see how that works. Hopefully you guys can see that. I'll make that a little bigger. Thank you so much again, Melissa. Who is going to win? You've stuck around until the end of this session. We had over 177 people join us today for this, Melissa. I love when so many people get such good information from people like yourself and other leaders in the industry. So the winner today, you hear the drum roll, the winner is Alejandra In. So Alejandra, congratulations on winning the $50 Amazon gift card. I don't give out last names on here. It's In is the last initial. There was only one Alejandra In on there, so I will use your email address to get that to you, and you should get that in the next day or two. A couple other things, if you want the slides, you can email me. Melissa, would it be okay for people to reach out to you for the slides as well?
Absolutely. Yep.
And what's a good way for them to reach out?
Any of the contact information, melissa.tondi@gmail.com or via my LinkedIn or my Twitter.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. And also this is recorded, so there will be a recording up right away when you go back to the same link. You can tell your friends, you can share that link again, and I'll update it and just trim off the little bit of space at the beginning and the end of this session just to make it look nice and pretty and tidy when you come back in to watch the recording. But thank you all so much for being here. I look forward to talking to you soon. If you don't have it already, get some automation, get test automation, call us. We can work through your challenges that you have with that. We can help you plan out your strategy for how you're going to do it. If you're transitioning from a mostly hands-on or manual testing world into an automation world, we do that all the time with large and small companies. There's our number, 984-244-2313, and you can reach me through any of the other means on there as well as through the website. Thank you so much for being here. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and thanks again, Melissa.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.